All right. So, you guys have kind of done a brief introduction to each other. Can you just say a little bit more about what you do and um, what brought you to this particular conversation?
Okay. Tom Ash, I help people communicate and train and I train in consulting to organizations that know that communication and relationship impact their bottom line. So sometimes I do a day-long event with a county or auditors or different professionals in a variety of world law, business analysts, courageous conversations for nice Minnesotans. The program I've done a lot. Andre came to one. I'm here because of Andre, and I'm impressed with him as a person and a teacher. And I think I have something to learn from him. And the title was provocative, so that's why
I'm Robin Getzig. I'm an art therapist, artist. My clients are all ages, all ethnicities, all lots of different populations and issues, and I teach. So just had this happen the other day where I was serving a girl and working with a girl for a few weeks. She had drug-induced psychosis, so she didn't even remember where she was, and then when she sort of came to, we went outside to a playground and she pulled her hair back and she had a swastika behind her ear. After like knowing her for a couple of weeks, it was just a weird thing, you know.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, what's that? And she made some excuse about what it meant before and came up with like, I don't know, it was just weird. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I want to be clear of that I know that this is particularly when we talk about Hitler and we talk about the Nazis and we talk about the swastika, that there are some pretty profound implications about even engaging in the conversation. And I would say that it's even more bombastic of me to imply that there is any connection to those events and the things that are happening here in the United States.
I think there are, so that's, I mean.
Yeah, yeah. But I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to sensationalize, trying to be an opportunist on some heavy-weighted issues. That this was an issue of inquiry that led me to the making the points that I'm going to make today. So, because I think that's extremely important, and for me, and both of you have had some encounter with me, that motive is oftentimes more important, at least to me, than the cursory impact that folks are trying to gain or have. So, so motive is extremely important, and I want to make that really clear that it was the inquiry that drove me to this point. And I think that there are some fundamental ways in which these things are connected, and I hope to make that case today in an intelligent and thought-provoking way. So. We'll be doing a number of things in the session. We'll obviously I gave you the PowerPoint, and those are all the slides that are in the PowerPoint. There's some videos that we'll watch that I hope kind of make the case and some of the points that I'm trying to make. And so my last name is Cohen, Koen, and so there are some folks in my family lineage that that are Jewish and practicing Jews. I happen not to be. The miracle that is America somewhat changed my destiny and how my family looks and how we interact with the world. So that's another piece that I pay attention to. It's really interesting sometimes when I show up for interviews, people are a little surprised that Andre Cohen looks the way he does, and we deal with that, and it has its.
Did you just find that out though?
What's that?
I mean, that you have Jewish lineage?
No, so for my family, it's been a part of our urban legends kinds of things. So there was a trunk found of Dutch money, and in our family had this. There were these family stories about being Dutch and being Jewish, and so well, kind of. So we've had these stories as folklore, and you just think it's old people talking kind of stuff. But I ran into a guy on Facebook whose name was Andre Cohen, Koen. But he pronounced his last name as Kuhn. So Andre, I don't know that necessarily would work for me here,
Terrible.
right? So, but in talking with him, he's in South Africa, and his family came from Denmark, and so some of those family legend pieces started to actually have some credibility. So that's
I thought it was, I think I asked you once, and you didn't.
yeah,
I
yeah. It may not have been important at that point, So but so that is that. So again, this workshop was part of an inquiry piece that I undertook and came across this particular book called The Hitler Salute. Now, Tillman Adler is a sociology professor from the United States who is in Germany currently, or at least he was at the time of this book, as a professor. And as an expat, he had he noticed some things in the German culture that he could, as an outsider who's now an insider, really observe and talk about. And one of those things was this idea of the Hitler salute. And one of the pieces, and I'm not sure if he had access to this piece of technology that we have access to today, so we'll address this today, was the idea that the cultural norms helped facilitate some things that people may not necessarily have believed or adopted themselves, but they were willing to participate in the system because there was some benefit to them. And that the pain of participating was lessened through their participation. So if I didn't participate, I'd feel more angst, more pain, but just the complicit participation in this particular salute allowed me to have access to things that, and relieve pain that I would have felt had I not gone along with that. And so some of the things that we'll talk about is this idea of the social networking concept of a meme. We'll talk about memes, and we'll talk about logos and logos and how those things show up. And then what are some of the ramifications of race as this kind of go along to get along kind of concept that typically we don't spend a whole lot of time challenging or thinking about. So, so there is that. So the book is relatively inexpensive, $6 or so, and I'd encourage you to kind of read it to explore more of just the common person's perspective on their participation in that Nazi regime. So there's that. So Tillman offers the Hitler salute, and and swastika is more than just a thing that people did uh, as their undying love for the fatherland, but it was also a norm behavior set. So it just became part of what happened. Um, I like to make the leap that race is the American version of these concepts, and a patriotic pride mixed with socio-economic undertones. In the USA, we have a normative version of these behaviors, and we call it the racial orthodoxy. And when I say racial orthodoxy, what comes up for you? What do you think that that means, the racial orthodoxy? Or what would be a racial orthodoxy in the United States? What do
Go
you
ahead, I'm
think?
thinking.
I think of religious orthodoxy is the truth, the right way, the way it should be. The racial orthodoxy, maybe the I'm not sure. I'm not sure what racial. I never ever heard that phrase.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
Can you make a good
Is
guess?
it a phrase? Is it a phrase you made up?
It is actually something that that I've kind of coined out of some observations. And once I give you the observations, you'll see how that has become coined,
Yeah.
right? So how that's been invented. But just thinking about orthodoxy, when you think about that, what do you think about it?
Extremism.
Extremism, right?
The truth as defined by the majority
Okay.
of a certain group.
Of a certain group,
Yeah.
right? And typically it's the truth,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
that orthodoxy is around this is the truth as we see it
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah.
And even though there are people who may be in our group, we're the most extreme when it comes to, or we're the most fundamental as it comes to these sets of beliefs, right? So it's the orthodoxy.
Yeah.
So here is, I'll give you an example of how I've come to kind of mint that idea of a racial orthodoxy. So I was watching a show called Blackish. I don't know if you've seen that show or not. I've actually stopped watching it because I just couldn't. It was vexing me too much. Right? So they had this episode where it was the holiday episode, and there was this big announcement came through. I think the father works at an advertising agency, and there was an announcement that came through that the Santa Claus that had been the Santa Claus for years had just died of a heart attack, right? And so he died of a heart attack, and so now they'll be looking for a new Santa Claus for this year's Christmas pageant. And so the protagonist, being African American, goes up to the head manager or supervisor, who happens to be a white guy, and he says, I'd like to talk to you about the Santa Claus for this year. He says, I'd like for you to be very open-minded when we think about who Santa Claus could be for this year. And he said, we're in a new millennium, and that there's so many advances that people are making, and we'd like to, wouldn't we like to show that in our company? And the supervisor says, you know what? You're absolutely right. I wasn't thinking about doing that. I wasn't thinking about that. But you're right. We should think outside the box. And the protagonist is like, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Think outside the box. And so it's now lunchtime. They gather everybody around the water cooler. The supervisor wants to make the announcement, and he says, I would like to announce the Santa Claus for this year's pageant. And it is Maria Vasquez from HR. And the black guy's mad. He's like, wait a minute, whoa. That's not how it's supposed to go. Because first it's supposed to be a white guy. Then it's supposed to be a black guy. Then it's supposed to be a woman. And then it's supposed to be a Hispanic, right? So when we talk about this racial orthodoxy, we certainly have in our heads and in our society the way things are supposed to go in terms of racial groups.
What was bothering you about the show, though? I mean, what did you like about the show?
I don't like they try to so it's about an hour show. They spend about 45 minutes kind of setting up the twist at the end, and I don't like the morals that they come up with. I don't like the twist that they do on some things. For example, one of the shows that they did was for Martin Luther King Day, and so the son wanted to go skiing with his friends when the family usually did something else. They did something else, and so he wanted to fight for the right to get to the mountaintop. That was uh, that was the joke, right? And I don't necessarily. And there's been lots of things like that where
like belittling, belittling or making it small.
yeah, making it small or just not giving it the seriousness that it needs to have. So
It's a comedy, but yes, it's very comedy.
yeah, and there are about three shows that I think that are like that. There's Blackish, there's Fresh Off the Boat, and then there's Christella, which you know, yeah, it's supposed to be smart humor, but it's really not. It's supposed to be kind of this irony that we can laugh at racism because it's gone. It's laughable, but we can look at disparities right now and recognize that that's not the case. So. Um, so we have this racial orthodox. Um, the salute and the swastika was a mark of membership and exclusion. Um, but it was commonly deformed as an intention to someone much more than it was demeaning. So it was trying to it became this non thing that was a thing. Something that wasn't important, something that was important became unimportant in its everyday use, right? So very much like um, the Xerox was trying to defend not having everything that's been made on a machine called a Xerox, because a Xerox was a particular thing, but with it being overly used, it became something else other than what its original intention was. And that's part of what happened with the salute and the swastika. The salute became fodder for opportunists and a mockery of or those who resisted it. Right. So its original intent was to be the serious thing, but with its overuse, it became something that opportunists used and people who were fighting against the resistance would use as a mockery. So people would do the salute who didn't even believe in all of the political rhetoric that they were under, but they did it oftentimes as a mockery. Um, and then some people did it to make sure that they could continue to sell their goods and so forth and so on. And I think we can see that with when we start talking about this idea of race, that there are racial opportunists, that when something goes down, they show up to somehow benefit from that as opposed to either um, helping folks work through that process or to diminish that process. And we also see that there are people who use this race construct and this idea of race baiting for their own benefit. I was watching so I like conspiracy theories. I like those things. I think they're very entertaining to me. And I really got sucked into this one. And I started out being very skeptical, and I was watching it. It was about an hour and a half long on YouTube. And so I'm watching this thing, and I'm getting sucked in, and the stuff that they're saying starts to sound really real. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is quite compelling, right? And then the last 15 minutes, you can survive this disaster by buying my survival kit. For $19.95, you can get blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, I almost, had I cut it off before I got to that part, I would have bought what they said as truth, as something not to be questioned, right? And so these opportunities, just like in those in Nazi Germany, they exist. I see a parallel with those kinds of folks today. Um, so one of the things we're going to talk about is this idea of understanding a meme, right? So are you familiar with memes? Have you heard of them? Or okay, all right. Can you share what you know, just in your limited exposure to memes, what you know about them?
I think they're like little patterns or little, remembering it right, it's a way of doing things, a pattern, or a gesture, or something across the culture.
Yes. Yep. No, you're right. You're really on the right path with that, right? So in biology, what is the smallest unit that we typically kind of reference when we start talking about biology?
Atoms.
Yep. So we can go down as small as a quark, right?
Yeah.
We can go a quark. We can go atoms. Typically, when we're talking specifically about biology, we typically stop right around the cell, right?
Yeah.
So we talk about the cell. And what have we adopted as our understanding of evolution and the success of biological entities? So how do biological entities exist or excel? What is that process called? What have we accepted? From a dude who went to an island.
Social Darwinism.
Darwinism, right? So this whole idea of Darwinism. And what is I mean, if we cut it across all of the extra stuff, what is the primary understanding of Darwinism? Survival of the fittest, right? And so the strongest cells live, the weaker cells die, they go on to create a higher being form, so forth and so on. So that's the biological process. Scientists now believe that there's also a mirrored process that happens psychologically. And that the smallest unit of measurement, much like a cell, are these memes. And that memes in and of themselves also fall under that social Darwinism, in that the strongest ideas survive and the weaker ideas die. And I don't know if you've even encountered where there were really good ideas, but they didn't have enough traction to actually survive, right? I'm going to date myself by talking about these two formats, but VHS and Betamax. Betamax, via technology, via scientific advancement, was a remarkably superior product to VHS. But VHS became what? It became mainstream because it was able to survive and adapt in some really critical ways, where even a more superior idea didn't make it. And we can see that through all sorts of products that we purchase or that we use today. Right? So the meme shows itself in public ways. In this particular case, the Hitler salute was a greeting. It communicated things, and I think it's really interesting that there's some German wordplay that happens with happened with the German salute. So it was Heil Hitler, right? Which the wordplay on that was Heil was also the word for heal. It was also the word for cure, right? So when people were saying the words, they also could have been meaning let's cure Hitler. So there's some wordplay that happens in that. When we talk about this idea of wordplay as it relates to these memes, what we also recognize is when we use the word race. So you fill out a form and it says, what is your racial designation, or what is your racial background, or what is your race? I find that word, R-A-C-E, very intriguing. Because as Alfred Adler would say, that people Alfred Adler would say that people are looking for safety, significance, and belonging, and that all human behavior is goal-directed. So if I look at this word, R-A-C-E, as it shows up on my HR forms, I find that very intriguing. Because what also is a R-A-C-E? Yeah, it's a contest. Mm-hmm. There's a winner. And so when people say there are human races, how does one win humanity? What is the contest for humanity? And so I find that very interesting. So I just made reference to this idea of Heil being Q or men and that kind of stuff, right? And then memes, again, are little pieces of thought. And so I was watching a movie that I actually quite enjoyed. I thought it was a really great movie until I started deconstructing parts of this movie. So there's a guy by the name of Tarantino. What's his first name? Quentin Tarantino, right? So Quentin Tarantino likes to use the N-word in lots of his movies. That's one of his favorite. I mean, you can count thousands or hundreds of times that word is used in his films. But there was something that caught my attention, and I wasn't sure why it caught my attention. And outside of all the stuff, so there's lots of stuff in the film that you really, once you deconstruct, you can just go, oh my goodness, they put this in the film. But there was this one particular scene where the protagonist, she is fighting all of these Asians, and these folks are called the Crazy 88s. I was like, oh, that's a cool little name. That's like the Crazy 88s. Until I started to deconstruct it after reading this book, what the 88s are. What are 88s? What letter of the alphabet is 8? Heil Hitler. So now I'm thinking.
Just mess that up. I mean, that's my son's birthday. 8-8.
8-8. Right? But there are tons of folks that was, for some folks, when they went underground, that's what they use. Today, when they're folks who are marginally, blah, blah, blah. So now I'm questioning Tarantino. Like, what's with the Crazy 88s? Right? So these things, once these memes start to develop, they get very sophisticated in how they maneuver through systems. And they can seem very benign. Go ahead.
Doesn't Heil also come from hail? Like
yes,
Hail Mary,
like Hail Mary. So
pray,
to pray, to worship, but it's also it's these as well, right? Yeah. To heal or cure or amend or blah blah blah. And so when people were saying these things, there were lots of meanings being given because these memes had started to develop and started to take form. So there are a couple of, when we start talking about this idea of race, particularly as it shows up in the United States, we have to deconstruct some mental models. So there's some mental models that have been built that are problematic for us, particularly since we the power in these mental models is not challenging them. And so we set up systems that don't challenge these things. This idea of black and white. Now, to be quite honest, there are no black people and there are no white people. So when we start thinking about this concept of so-called race along black and white lines, we're actually talking about absolutes, right? We're talking about absolutes. And so we have to kind of deconstruct that. This idea that diversity has a direct relationship with low standards, we have to dispel that, because those two things are not related. That you can have diversity and have high standards, right? So and so when we talk about diversity, I want to be clear that what I mean by that is looking at our total differences. Looking at our differences, analyzing those differences. Another way you can think about diversity is prior to, have you ever made a cake? Anyone made a cake?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So before you make the cake, what do you have? What do you start with? Before you even get the ingredients, you have a recipe. And what does the recipe tell you? How to make the cake. And it typically gives you the ingredients, right? So for our organizations, the recipe is the mission and the goals of our organization. And those missions and goals will tell us what kind of ingredients we need to have in that organization. Now, the ingredients. So you set out, so typically when I would make a cake, I put all the ingredients out on the table so I could make sure that I had everything that I needed. When I didn't have what I needed, I would have a disparity. I'd be missing something, right? So I have to run to the store or do a substitute or whatnot. Now, I have all of these ingredients out on the table. That is diversity. Having those ingredients on the table, is that the cake?
No.
It's not the cake.
You gotta mix it together.
I got to mix them together. I got to take them to a process. I got to have a pan. There's so many more things that come after we talk about our differences. When we start talking about this idea of diversity and low standards become a value judgment on the diversity. Are the eggs more valuable than the sugar in your cake? I don't know what your taste buds preferences are, but there's no one thing that's more important. However, you may be able to substitute some other things or make some augmentation, but there's no value as to which one of those things is more valuable. The other thing that we have to talk about is this idea of implicit bias and its direct relationship to systemic oppression. So when I have things that I'm not thinking about and I'm operating on those biases, I am fueling systemic oppression. Because the system won't run unless somebody is running it, right? Unless somebody's participating. And then there's this idea of that micro inequity, which is the sum total of microaggressions, has a direct relationship to discretionary effort. And micro inequities are all these things, negative things that happen to people that they can't sue over. Somebody, the kids would say, he mean mugged me, right? Well, I can't sue over somebody looking at me wrong. But it doesn't build up my humanity. And every microaggression or sets of micro inequity increases my discretionary effort. And my discretionary effort is the amount of work that I'm willing to do. So my employer would love for me to operate at 100%. But technically, I can get away with 75%. And if I'm experiencing microaggressions or micro inequity, I might stick with that 75%. Which means my employer is losing what? 25% of my productivity, all because somebody's being goofy in the office. Right? And then there's the racial orthodoxy, and then we need a new paradigm. Right? So there isn't a hierarchy of racial groups as it relates to getting access in the United States. However, we typically try to treat it as such. We try to treat folks as if there is a racial orthodoxy. Or maybe there is a racial orthodoxy, but we just need to change that to a new paradigm. And I think 2050 will help with that. That was a joke. Demographics change. So the typical racial orthodoxy, there's the Caucasoid, the Africoid, the Mongoloid, the American, and the Australialoid. I don't know how you say that. Australoid. Astraloid. In the American political arena, we typically talk about the orthodoxy is white males, black males, then white women, then Hispanic men, and then Hispanic women, and Asians and natives are way at the political bottom in terms of what this racial orthodoxy kind of looks like. I'm not suggesting that it is correct in doing so, but I am trying to illuminate something that happens. When we talk about neighborhoods, what typically happens is neighborhoods go from being white to Jewish to black to some kind of immigrant group, and sometimes it's the Hispanic, Asians, natives, and then lastly are the hipsters who come back and revitalize the neighborhood to establish it back as white. I'm not saying that this racial orthodoxy is correct. I mean, I'm not saying that it is the right way of being. I am saying these are some observations that I've made in terms of how those things have happened. I was just at over in Minneapolis on 36th and Lindale, and I was looking for this chicken shop because there used to be a little chicken store where you get fried chicken, broiled chicken, and I went over there and it's not there because there's this hip coffee shop that
South or north?
South. You know what I'm talking about? That right down.
Yeah, I know.
I don't know what it used to be.
Yeah, I don't know what it used to be, but it's like this place is hip. Like I'm like, hey, but I've never seen so many white people on that part of South Minneapolis in a long time. But I hadn't been down there in a while. But they gentrified things and blah blah blah. Well, at any rate, that's the concept of racial orthodoxy. That there is a value attached to each one of these so-called racial groups, and so we'll spend some time talking about that. So race has become one of our obligatory rituals. It's imposed from outside of us. It has become a meme of its own. So race is like started to develop and transcend even what other folks try to say that it is. And so it is growing and changing. For example, the woman who was the head of the NAACP in Spokane, Washington, right? Someone asked her if she was African American. She said, "No, I am not African American, but I am black." Well, if I go back to the racial orthodoxy, that doesn't fit into the orthodoxy, right? But she obviously has started to create some things that weren't there before. So the meme in and of itself is changing and growing. So what does it mean to be black? What does it mean to be white? What does it mean to be Asian? Those things are constantly developing and changing as things go forward. And our skin color becomes both our logo and our logos, right? It becomes what people see. It becomes the brand. It becomes the identity. It becomes the truth that people see, even when it is not so, even when it is not true. And so race is constantly becoming. And so the Constitution of the United States tries to identify some ways to protect humanity, but we'll find out one of the fundamental flaws with its ability to do that. So there's the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare and security of blessings to ourselves and our posterity, we do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. Paragraph 2 of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sounds great. While these things are being touted, what also is happening? So we're saying all these great things. What else is happening simultaneously?
At which point?
Either, both. It's happening at both points. We're saying all these great things about freedom and liberty and blessing.
People are oppressed. People are oppressed. They're not free.
Not only are they oppressed, they're in an economic system called slavery. Right?
Yeah.
So how is it that we can say that we have this great preamble and we have this great declaration, but we are keeping other folks in this economic system called slavery? How do we justify that?
You say slaves are not real people.
They're not people. We conjure up this thing called race to justify this kind of stuff. Right? So I'm going to show just a couple of videos. I think we have time. So that's good. I'm going to show a couple of videos. One is about the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah. So we'll watch this video. Turn the volume up. Okay. Turn it up. Turn it up.
Yeah, sound can be tricky.
Yeah.
I do a lot of presenting, and half the time the sound is a real obstacle. You got it plugged in the right hole on your laptop.
Yeah. There we go.
Is that it?
I think most people wouldn't know me. I'm an old Chicago founder of this idea.
Hi, my name is John Green. This is Crash Course. About slavery. Slavery is not funny. In fact, it's very near the top of the list of things that aren't funny. So today's episode is going to be a little light on the jokes. But I'm going to help you understand what pre-Civil War Americans often euphemistically refer to as the peculiar institution. Slavery is as old as civilization itself, although it's not as old as humanity thanks to our hunting and gathering foremothers. But the numbers involved in the Atlantic slave trade are truly staggering. From 1500 to 1880 CE, somewhere between 10 and 12 million African slaves were forcibly moved from Africa to America, and about 16% of those people died during the journey. I know you're saying, that looks like a very nice ship. I mean, my God, it's almost as big as South America, yet not the case. And those who didn't die became property, bought and sold like any commodity. Where Africans came from and went to changed over time. But in all, 48% of slaves went to the Caribbean and 41% to Brazil. Although few Americans recognize this, relatively few slaves were imported to the U.S., only about 5%. So it's also worth noting that by the time Europeans started importing Africans into the Americas, Europe had a long history of trading slaves. The first known European slave trade began after the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the crusade that you will remember as the crazy one. Italian merchants imported thousands of Armenian, Circassian, and Georgian slaves to Italy. Most of them were women who worked as household servants, but many worked processing sugar. And sugar is, of course, a crop that African slaves later cultivated in the Caribbean. Camera 2 side note. None of the primary crops grown by slaves, sugar, tobacco, coffee, is necessary to sustain human life. So in a way, slavery is a very early byproduct of a consumer culture that revolves around the purchase of goods that bring us pleasure, but not sustenance. You are welcome to draw your own metaphor if you One of the big misconceptions about slavery, at least when I was growing up, was that Europeans somehow captured Africans, put them in chains, stuffed them on boats, and then took them to the Americas. The chains and ships bit is true, as is the America part, if you define America as America and not as America. But Africans were living in all kinds of conglomerations, from small villages to city-states to empires, and they were much too powerful for the Europeans to just come. And in fact, Europeans obtained African slaves by trading. Because trade is a two-way proposition, this meant that Africans were captured by other Africans and then traded to Europeans in exchange for goods, usually like metal tools or fine textiles or guns. And for those Africans, slaves were a form of property and a very valuable one. In many places, slaves were one of the only sources of private wealth because land was usually owned by the state. And this gets to a really important point. If we're going to understand the tragedy of slavery, we need to understand the economics of it. We need to get inside what Mark Twain famously called a deformed conscience. We have to see slaves both as they were, as human beings, and as they were viewed as an economic commodity. Right, so you probably know about the tremendous conditions aboard slave ships, which at their largest could hold 400 people. But it's worth underscoring that each slave had an average of 4 square feet of space. That is 4 square feet. As one eyewitness testified before Parliament in 1791, they had not so much room as a man. Once in the Americas, the surviving slaves were sold to the market very similar to the way cattle would be sold. After purchased, slave owners would often brand their new possession on their cheeks, again, just as they would do with cattle. The lives of slaves were dominated by work and terror, but mostly work. Slaves did all types of work, from housework to skilled crafts work, and some even worked as sailors, but the majority of them worked as agricultural labor. In the Caribbean and Brazil, most of them planted, harvested, and processed sugar, working 10 months out of the year, dawn until dusk. The worst part of this job, which is saying something because there were many bad parts, was fertilizing the sugar cane. This required slaves to carry 80-pound baskets of manure on their heads up and down hilly terrain. Mr. Green, isn't there a poop joke in there somewhere? No. This whole thing is too depressing. When it came time to harvesting process, became speed was incredibly important because once cut, sugar sap can go sour within a day. This meant that slaves would often work 48 hours straight during harvest time, working without sleep in the sweltering sugar press houses where the cane would be crushed in hand rollers and then boiled. Slaves often caught their hands in the rollers, and their overseers set the hatchet on hands for amputation. Given these appalling conditions, it's little wonder that the average life expectancy for a Brazilian slave on a sugar plantation in the 18th century, 23. Things were slightly better in British sugar colonies like Barbados, and in the U.S., living and working conditions were better still. So relatively good, that in fact, slave populations began increasing naturally, meaning that more slaves were born than died. This may sound like a good thing, but it is of course its own kind of evil, because it meant that slave owners were calculating that if they kept their slaves healthy enough, they would reproduce, and then the slave owners could steal and sell their children, or use them to work their land. Either way, anyway, this explains why even though the percentage of slaves imported from Africa to the United States was relatively small, slaves and other people of African descent came to make up a significant portion of the U.S. population. The brutality of working conditions in Brazil, on the other hand, meant that slaves were never able to increase their population naturally. Hence, we continued to import slaves into Brazil until slavery ended in the 1880s. So I noted earlier that slavery isn't new. It's also a hard word to define. Like Stalin forced millions to work in the gulags, but we don't usually consider those people slaves. On the other hand, many slaves in history had lives of great power, wealth, and influence. Like remember Zheng He, the world's greatest admiral? He was technically a slave. So were many of the most important advisors to Suleiman's magnificence. So was Darth Vader. But Atlantic slavery was different and more horrifying because it was chattel slavery, a term historians use to indicate that the slaves were movable property. Oh, it's time to open letters. An open letter to the word slave. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's Boba Fett, noted owner of a ship called Slave One. Apparently a ballet dancer.
That's a fine approximation of ballet music.
Thank you, Stan. Dear slave as a word, you are overused. Like Britney Spears on the slave number 4 letter. You know you're not. Boba Fett's ship, Slave One. A ship can't be a slave. But more importantly, slave, you are constantly used in political rhetoric and never correctly. There's nothing new about this. Witness, for instance, all the early Americans claiming that paying the stamp tax would make them slaves. And that was at a time when they knew exactly what slavery looked like. Taxes, as I mentioned before, could be very useful. I, for instance, like to pay roads, but even if you don't like a tax, it's not slavery. Here, I have written for you a list of all the times that it is okay to use the word slave. Oh, it is a one-item long list! Best wishes. So what exactly makes slavery so horrendous? Well, definitions are slippery, but I'm going to start with the definition of slavery proposed by sociologist Orlando Hatch. It is a permanent, violent, and personal domination of native and generation. According to this definition, the slave moves from the culture, land, and society of his or her birth and suffers what Patterson called social death. Ultimately, then, what makes slavery slavery is that slaves are dehumanized. The Latin word that gave us chattel also gave us cattle. In many ways, Atlantic slavery grew from a lot of previous models of slavery and took everything that sucked about each of them and combined them into a big ball so that it would be the biggest possible ball of suck. Am I allowed to say stuff on this show? Okay, to understand what I'm talking about, we need to look at the previous models of slavery. Let's go to the problem. The Greeks were among the first to consider otherness a characteristic of slaves. Most Greek slaves were barbarians, and their inability to speak Greek kept them from talking back to their masters, and also indicated their slave status. Aristotle, who, despite being spectacularly wrong about almost everything, was incredibly influential, believed that some people were just naturally slaves, saying, it is clear that there are certain people who are free and certain people who are slaves by nature, and it is both to their advantage and just for them to be slaves. This idea, despite being totally insane, remained popular for millennia. The Greeks popularized the idea that slaves should be traded from far away, but the Romans took it to another level. Slaves probably made up 30% of the total Roman population, similar to the percentage of slaves in America at slavery's height. The Romans also invented the plantation, using vast numbers of slaves to work the land on giant farms called latifundia, so called because they were not farms. The Judeo-Christian world contributed as well, and while we are not going to venture into the incredibly complicated role that slavery plays in the Bible, because I vividly remember the comment section from the Christianity episode, the Bible was widely used to justify slavery, and in particular the enslavement of Africans, because of the moment in Genesis when Noah curses Ham, saying, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." This encapsulates two ideas vital to Atlantic slavery. One, that slavery can be a hereditary status passed down through generations, and two, that slavery is the result of human sin. Both ideas serve as powerful justifications for holding an entire race in bondage. Thanks, Paul. But there were even more contributors to the idea of Atlantic slavery. During this, Muslim Arabs were the first to report large number of Spanish-speaking Africans into their territory as slaves. The Muslims called these Africans Zands, and they were a distinct and despised group, distinguished from other North Africans by the color of their skin. The Zands, a territory held by the Abbasids, staged one of the first big slave revolts in 869 CE, and it may be that this revolt was so devastating that it convinced the Abbasids that large-scale plantation-style agriculture on the Roman model just wasn't worth it. So by then, they connected the Aristotelian idea that some people are just naturally slaves with the appearance of sub-Saharan Africans. The Spanish and the Portuguese, you no doubt remember, were the Europeans with the closest ties to the Muslim world because there were Muslims living on the Iberian Peninsula until 1492, so it makes sense that the Iberians would be the first to influence these racist attitudes toward blacks. And as the first colonizers of the Americas and the dominant importers of slaves, the Portuguese and the Spanish helped define the attitudes that characterized Atlantic slavery, beliefs it inherited from a complicated nexus of all the slaveholders who came before. In short, Atlantic slavery was a monstrous trend, but it was a tragedy in which the whole world participated. And it was the culmination of millennia of imaginings of other and inherently less. It's tempting to pin all the blame for Atlantic slavery on one particular group, but to blame one group is to exonerate all the others and by extension ourselves. The truth that we must grapple with is that a vast array of our ancestors, including those we think of as ours, whoever they may be, believed that it was possible for their fellow human beings to be mere property. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is produced and directed by Dan Muller. Our script supervisor is Danica Johnson. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raul Bonner, and my
I love Crash Course. It's real quick, in-depth, thorough, doesn't pull any punches. Thoughts about the slave trade? There are a couple of other videos. We won't have time to go to those, but there's a video on Reconstruction, and it really talks about the 13th and 14th Amendment and the light that really was the opportunity for us to build a new society was shortly turned off, particularly after the assassination of President Lincoln. And so there were some great strides that were made, and then it wasn't until the 1950s that we start seeing a resurgence of some of those racial policies that actually started to create some momentum for equality in our society. So there are those things. I wanted to point out Godwin's law because I think it's very interesting that Godwin's law also applies to this concept of race. And Godwin's law is basically, if there's ever a conversation about anything, it's not, at some point in that conversation, Nazis or Germany will be mentioned as that analogy will be made. And I would say that the same would be said about race. That particularly there are tons of conversations that can happen, but there's always some kind of implication that race could pop up more often than not, particularly when there's a disagreement or something. So, Godwin's law. And so we start talking about these ideas of memes. And so memes, what I think is really interesting is that memes become these catalysts for cultural ideas, right? So they're the smallest form, these cells of thought, if you will. And I think it's interesting that when we have a kid who has candy in his hair, these are Jolly Ranchers in his hair, we call that ghetto. Not we, but people call that ghetto, as if that's unsophisticated. But when we have packages and people sell for people to decorate their beards, we call that clever. So, if someone wants to decorate their beard, that's clever. However, if someone wants to decorate their hair, we call that unsophisticated, right? We call that ghetto. And I think I see some differences between that, and that we have that racial hierarchy or that racial orthodoxy in play. That what's acceptable or clever for one group of folks isn't clever for another. There's also another version of these cultural ideas and these memes really being harmful, in that we have. So I was born on October 30th. It used to be my absolute favorite time of the year. I now hate it and deplore this time of year. And why might that be, given the nature of things?
Halloween.
Halloween is people dress up as other people, right? And so we have that phenomenon that happens. And then there's a card game called Cards Against Humanity. And I don't know if you've played that game or been exposed to the game, but it's absolutely the most horrendous game in terms of equity and diversity. It's doing so much harm in terms of how it talks about every group. It's the soupy sales of card games. It's the inverse of apples to apples, but it's every negative thing that you can. I'm not sure if you remember soupy sales or no soupy sales.
No.
Okay, it's just a blue comedian, lots of put downs. At any rate, Cards Against Humanity. There's some more about memes. And this is what happens when some of these memes get out of control, when we start not taking race seriously. So we have, actresses and people in the community who dress up as people for fashion or for fun. And so this was a picture from a ghetto party. And so the people have rags on their heads and gold teeth and tinfoil in their mouth. And so this was from a university, and they had some college kids were going to have a party, and it was a Native American party, and they said it's not like my ancestors killed you, kind of thing, right? So, and then more pictures of people dressing up as other people, and it's so interesting that these memes of race even have black people dressing up as black people, right? So even black people dressing up in blackface, which is a phenomenon that's all its own as well. So when we talk about this idea, it becomes really important to recognize what's going on, because if we're not critical in our thinking and we don't challenge these thoughts, then they become the normative set of behaviors. And the folks who have orchestrated this, the folks who are driving this, never get examined. And so this next video I'm going to show you, I think is very powerful. It's called Race Baiting 101, and I think it's powerful because it exposes the system that race, particularly in the United States, has come to be. So I'm going to play this one. And all of these are on YouTube, so you can find these tools yourself at your convenience.
I think most people wouldn't know me. I'm an old manga after I don't.
My name is Matthew Cook, and this is a demonstration on how to race bait. First, let's talk about some of the stereotypes expressed in the 17th and 18th centuries. The vile and brutish parts of mankind, the marks of an alien race. Those were how the gentleman class described whites, poor whites to be exact, from Europe, many of whom were duped by a con game, promised an all-expense-paid trip to the New World in return for years of free labor on the other side. Then there were those sentenced to work for 5 to 7 years of forced labor. In the 1700s alone, over 50,000 documented white men and women were shipped to the colonies and auctioned off as labor for crimes from petty theft, trespassing, or pickpocketing. A slave was considered unfortunate, not inferior. To become a slave in the ancient world was not based on skin color, but the result of being on the losing side in a war. White indentured servants 400 years ago were seen as more or less the same as African slaves. They also made easy alliances, raging against greed, unfair taxes, oppressive land use regulations. And in the 1670s, one of those alliances nearly burned Jamestown to the ground. And the last to surrender were 100 men, 80 black, 20 white. And a law enforcement system was created. give whites slightly more privileges and force a separation in their contact with blacks. This three-tiered caste system, blacks on the bottom, poor whites a notch above, now treated more favorably, made them feel as though one day they might improve their status. They just worked hard enough. Maybe some did, but most did not, especially as the life expectancy was only 35. As all rights and freedoms were taken from Africans, this new racial caste system protected the wealthy landowners, who in the South would soon become known as the masters. And if you're interested in reading more about this, there's a page-turning thriller, not exaggerating, called The People's History of the United States, which you can download as an audiobook to support this series. The creation of that three-tiered caste system is the moment the modern institution of racial slavery is born, which would brutalize, divide, and crush the spirits of black men, women, and children for the next 200 years, and give many poor whites the idea that though their lives might be miserable, at least they weren't black. Until 1863. And as Michelle Alexander writes in The New Jim Crow, former slaves had a brief moment in the sun before they returned to a state akin to slavery or worse. The unprecedented economic might of the new United States, built on the backs of an enormous free slave labor force, would arguably be the single greatest factor contributing to what would soon become the world's largest modern superpower. And in gratitude, instead of helping freed slaves find homes, reunite with families, or help anyone, at the very least, heal from a 300-year-old trauma, they were largely neglected by the North, faced rampant disease, outbreaks of smallpox, cholera, many starved to death, and for the next 100 years, this thing called Jim Crow just took over for slavery. Enforced by government, courts, and law officers, forcing a continuation of an already well-established racial caste system on every aspect of American life. Ministers said whites were the chosen people, blacks cursed to be servants. God supported racial segregation. Craniologists, eugenicists, phrenologists, and social Darwinists at every educational level reinforced the belief that blacks were in every way inferior to whites. Massive social disadvantages, compounded by predatory lending and housing markets, and legally regulating blacks into ghettos, discriminatory bank lending practices, severe job discrimination, not to mention the lynchings, all continued until the 1960s. Now we're only talking 50 years. We finally have the Civil Rights Act. Black nationalism and black power, black pride. For the first time, a public promise of opportunity after 3 centuries of the opposite. Communities getting to police their own streets, but the black pride forces are soon struck down by the law and order. And what takes the place of what was once called Jim Crow? The invention of the largest prison industry in the world, in the form of new laws, tougher laws, more laws, longer sentences, mandatory minimums, more prisons, more police, and a barbaric war on drugs, which should be called the war on people, where blacks are far more likely to be arrested for selling and possessing drugs than whites, even though whites use drugs at the same rate, and are actually more likely to sell drugs. Blacks who've committed the exact same crimes as whites are more likely to be arrested and prosecuted, more likely to have longer prison sentences. Families deprived of breadwinners and once again deprived of the right to vote. Generations sentenced to a revolving door in and out of a prison system so unstoppable that 1 out of 3 black men born today can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. And so despite the existence of so many notable, heroic black, brown, and white cops saving lives and rescuing victims from unimaginable horrors across the country, righteous lawyers, wise judges, honest legislators doing great things that cannot and should never be overlooked, overall, Black America has never seen a substantive break in law enforcement service to larger forces ever on the wrong side of history. Policing for petty regulatory violations like failure to use a turn signal or lacking a front license plate. And so here we are today. 30% of America are minorities, but represent 60% of the prison population. Over 1 million men and women. And so the majority of Black America, 70%, understandably have little trust in law enforcement and the criminal justice system. But don't be fooled. This prison industrial complex has not only swept up Black America, but all people of limited means, hunting minorities and the poor at rates higher than any other on the planet. This thing grew bigger than anyone could have imagined. It's militarized and increased in scope and aggression, and as racist as it clearly is, even if we took all the minorities out of the equation, leaving only the white majority, we would still be over-incarcerated. We would still have vile police brutality. We would still have a criminal justice system desperately in need of reform. So just like the days of early slavery. Today, we still have a three-tiered system. With notable exceptions, slightly more than half of Black Americans graduate from high school, compared to three-quarters of white Americans. And Black males are twice as likely to be unemployed as white males. Moving on to the second tier, we have poor whites, treated the second worst as a whole. With many more notable exceptions, so many we think it wasn't the case, white America is also in very bad shape. The real poverty rate for the U.S. as a whole is staggeringly close to 50%. We have a myth of social mobility that is one of the worst in the industrialized world due to decades of disinvestment from communities sending cheap labor overseas, leading depressed, isolated local economies with no jobs, a dwindling tax base, and nothing to attract business or new residents. But why is this? As the great journalist Emily Cleet says, we should never say the word poverty without the words inequality and injustice being far behind. People become poor, not by personal failing, but because the system is engineered to push them down and keep them down. Yet despite numerous horrific incidents of police brutality and criminal injustice against whites, the beating of a homeless man or a horse thief to near death or to death, with 1 million whites in prison, unprecedented in our nation's history, the majority of whites today, 57%, still have quite a lot, or a great deal of confidence in police, and a majority think the justice system is fair. The poor whites and victims of criminal injustice and inequality are spread out across the country and heavily divided by culture and politics. The so-called liberal or conservative news media is owned by 6 mega media companies that control 90% of our information. Those companies are owned by the very rich. According to Forbes, the 400 wealthiest Americans today have more money than the poorer half of the entire population of the United States. While less than 4% of our entire country are millionaires, they make up over half the members of Congress. Who do you think millionaires represent? The elite who run the country in a different revolving door of economic royalty have demonstrated certainly that they are above prosecution. So with a news media that mostly reports only on the black outrage of police brutality, which is and has been at a boiling point for the last 300 years, the white majority is confused. They make all kinds of assumptions. The white minority were aware of the horrors of the criminal injustice system, but unaware of the history of Black America, feel themselves being lumped into the police. When they scream at Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson and call them race baiters, they're right to scream, but they're screaming at the wrong faces. The media is terrified to let the mass of Americans know the truth about our three-tiered caste system alive and well and keeping us alive. Why do I need to identify with those ancestors before me that committed genocide, and not only enslaved, but brutalized the people who in chains and in struggle for civil rights created and inspired some of the greatest art, music, culture, writing, ideas, invention, and humanity the world has ever seen? I identify with being part of that struggle. I don't need to be proud of my blood because the same color red gives life to us all. I don't need to be proud of the color of my skin because I was never told I needed to be ashamed of it. True shame is only for those who have hate in their hearts. And that can be cool. I don't need to be proud of my religion because all the great religions warn us against pride. I'm privileged to be a white, straight male in a society that favors those traits for which I had nothing to do with. Favors I might not even know I had. I grew up poor. There were a few years I was homeless, but I did not grow up black. And I was blessed in my childhood to see the difference. To paraphrase Van Jones, even in a hoodie, I look less like Trayvon than I do like Mark Zuckerberg. So along the way of forming my identity as a human being, I choose to identify all of humanity in a struggle for harmony. You are my ally, and I am yours. I don't need to be better than someone else to feel good about myself. I need to feel the same. I acknowledge racism as existing and alive as it ever was, and in doing so, I eliminate any invented wall between us. When we ally ourselves with a movement that's been asking to just acknowledge for 4 odd centuries how overdue it is to just say 3 words, Black Lives Matter, then united, we are a power that will shake the masters to their core. Yes, I say masters of the global economy that exploits not only our own nation but the entire planet. The masters of the commercial news, the military-industrial complex, prison complex, the overwhelming majority of the government. The masters corrupted by the influence too much power has on all human beings. For injustice and inequality are one and the same. Black, brown, white, sisters, brothers. The class struggle unites us all, as it always has. Race baiters, you are exposed.
Thoughts? duty. You know, they hardly even know what to say.
I don't, almost like that Facebook, you know, I say something, this is wrong thing, but I, you know,
I think it's a lot of interesting history, but it's through a certain lens that doesn't inspire me. It's heavy, it feels negative, you know. Uh, it feels like a natural counterpoint to Fox News. That's like the polar opposite for Fox News in a way. Uh, but it felt so I felt disempowered, sort of like, oh, everything's going to hell, there's nothing we can do. It was sort of a disempowering feeling to me. Everything's so bad, the prison system is so, um, and the link between prison and slavery is not a new one, but it's an interesting one. It was laid out very nicely, and I appreciate the clarity around that. It was really interesting. Disturbing. It's stuff that I probably I don't consciously try to ignore, but I just don't see that kind of stuff. So when you see that much in that short of a period of time, I feel defensive, and then I want to read it as negative.
Mm-hmm.
That's what.
Yeah. No, it's heavy stuff, and so I showed that particular video to to some folks, and they 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 disagreed with his three-tiered caste system that he lays out, and I said, why is that? She said, because there's a middle class, and I said that's interesting. Middle. I said, so what purpose is so what is this middle class? What is the purpose of that? And and she said, well, it's in between. I said, in between what? She said the masters, as he lays it out in the video, and the poor people. So I said, that's very interesting that you put that way, because it's like I hear people say that 40 is the new 20, but I never hear 20-year-olds saying that. So the middle class for me could be my medication around not being willing to accept the fact that I have to work for my money. Because the only class, they don't work they don't work the way the rest of us do. They encourage other people to work, and so that I think that's very interesting. For me, I think that what was most compelling was just the enlightenment or shining the light on the system that I have not been that I've known about but could not label as succinctly as he was able to do. And so, the question is, what am I supposed to do? What's my charge given that? That's for me to decide. Um, but I really appreciate him being able to lay that out. Uh, and to kind of further even talk about this idea of this kind of racial orthodoxy, and I think he laid those pieces out, right? That idea. If we look at race and ethnic identification currently, we have some things that are very strange that don't make a whole lot of sense when we talk about this idea of race here, even in the United States. So we know that race is not biological, right? So there are distinct markers in genes that make us one race versus another race, or another. There are no biological markers for race. We also know that race is geopolitical. So you could have a person who's in Spain, uh, who's in Spain, but then they come to the United States and then they become quasi-Hispanic, right? So they may have been white in Spain, but now they come to the United States and they're Hispanic, right? Or in the case of one of my friends, uh, he was trying to enroll, or he was enrolled. I'm not sure how that happened, but they changed the blood quantum for his particular tribe, and so overnight he went from being not American Indian to being American Indian overnight, right? So what we understand is this idea of race is also geopolitical, and it also has some economic political impacts on us, as we saw demonstrated in the previous video. One of the things that I did as the affirmative action officer, I was responsible for calculating and generating reports on racial designations as provided by the federal government. And so this is a direct quote directly from one of the forms that I use in the EEO4 report, which is the government's report. The for-profit businesses would do an EEO1 report, and these are the racial identifiers that they're looking for. So I wanted to put their caveat as a part of this conversation. It says race and ethnic designations are as used by the Equal Opportunity Commission do not denote scientific definitions of anthropological origins. What is that a fancy way of saying?
Biological.
It's not biological. It's not based on science. So if it's not based on science, what is it based on? And unfortunately, they don't say, right? So here we go. So the definitions of race and ethnicity are as follows. Hispanic or Latino, a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture of origin, regardless of race. So this sounds like this trumps everything, doesn't it? Right? And then white, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. So Iranians are white. Moroccans, Israelis are Palestinians are white.
Wow.
Right? So black or African American, non-Hispanic or Latino, because if you are Hispanic or Latino, then you're this, but you're not that. A person having origins in any of the black racial groups of Africa.
Still used now.
Yep, right now.
Well, what do you, you know, like,
Now here is the interesting thing. So people self-select these. However, if they do not self-select, there is a person on staff who is paid to make the designation for you.
Where is this?
What? This is the EEO report. So any organization that has more than 50 employees has to file this report. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, not Hispanic or Latino, a person having origins of any of the peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Islands. Asian, but not Hispanic or Latino, is a person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam.
Now, I don't know about you, but I've had friends from these various countries, and to look at their phenotype, they do not look like they should come from the same racial group as identified by the federal government of the United States as Asian. And then we have American Indian or Alaskan Native, not Hispanic or Latino. A person having any of the origins of any of the original peoples of North and South America, including Central America. And what does "and" mean? Also including, right? So any persons having the original peoples of North and South America, and who maintain tribal affiliation. So if I don't maintain tribal affiliation, what am I? So, and who maintain tribal affiliation or community attachment. So either I need to have tribal affiliation or community attachment to be American Indian. Now, what happens if my grandparents went to boarding schools where they were taught not to have community attachment and not to be affiliated? What are we? So this idea that it's geopolitical and there are economic consequences is very interesting, because where would Russians fall?
White.
Would they be white? Because white is Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Russia is where? Russia's in Asia. Which means that they would be Asian by this. But why are they not listed here? Because we have a political reason for not identifying Russians.
Wow.
So when we talk about this idea of race, and we try to talk about it as if it is a thing, it actually is very much made up. So there's a piece I want to watch on kids and race. And so this is where the rubber meets the road, where these memes, these thoughts, these ways of thinking about race become extremely important to talk about, because now we're starting to look at the next generations and what their beliefs are going to be about this idea of race. All right, great.
Would they be in a really important special for kids on race in the picture? It's a project over a year in the making. Race relations is one of the most explosive issues in the country, and for many adults, the most taboo to talk about with kids. But what a lot of adults don't realize is that kids, even as young as 6 years old, are already talking about or thinking about race. And what they say is making friends with kids of other races is hard and only gets harder as they grow up. We teamed up with renowned child psychologist Dr. Melanie Killen to scientifically measure children's attitudes on race. Take a look at this. Dr. Killen and her team showed 6-year-old children this picture and asked them questions like, what's happening here? Are these children friends, and would their parents want them to be friends? The picture is designed to be ambiguous. What's happening is in the eyes of a beholder. Then they showed them this picture and asked the same question. Now the only difference, the pictures, the race of the children was flipped. Both white and African American children were tested, and in addition to the 6-year-olds, the psychologist showed a similar set of pictures to 13-year-olds. At our request, they also asked kids open-ended questions about race to try to understand how it plays into their own lives. The responses were raw. Some of the experiences they described were frankly shocking. This is the reality of what kids see, hear, and think about race.
If you have the same skin, you can play together, but if you don't have the same skin, you can't play together.
So why can't you play together if you have different color skin?
Because your mom might not want you to play with that friend.
It's okay to tell people that they can't be your friend because of the color of their skin? Why is that okay?
Because their mom did not want them to be the same, be a different color friends.
And there's a big reason for kids to keep us as friends, that it would be okay to have other types of people with them.
They're not really. Probably because they might get in trouble.
Why would a parent want you to get in trouble if you wanted someone to come over to your house who is a different skin color?
Probably because they don't allow.
Why not? Why would some parents not allow other skin colored kids to come over?
Probably because they might not want that skin color. I've been really different, like the way I look and the way I was skin in my previous school that I went to. And they just kept on bullying me, and I didn't like it. I just asked them to stop, like, okay, look again. And then I tried not to break, but I couldn't hold on anymore. So I asked my mom, can I leave?
My grandparents had a lot of they're very racist against African Americans and like other races, but it's 2012, so they have to like push that aside, and they'll be like, no, that's wrong to me. You want to stick with your own race, and I'm like, no, that's it.
Well, there was more. Our CNN study found signs of hope and progress as well.
If somebody has like a different kind of skin color, if they're their friend, you always should be friends. So like I have tons of friends that are black and I'm white.
It doesn't matter what skin color you are. It's just inside here, like in your heart.
This is the second time that 360 has scientifically studied children and race. Back in 2010, we discovered that kids as young as 5 picked up on racial attitudes in the world around them, and all the ugliness that can sometimes come with that. And at this time around, we want to understand why children have these attitudes on race, how those attitudes change as kids get older, and how the race of their classmates may shape the adults they're going to become. We begin tonight with the results of the younger children in our study.
Oh, you don't have to like color skin.
We tested 145 kids in 6 schools spread across 3 states. Schools had 3 different racial makeups: majority white, majority African American, and racially diverse.
Why do you think the Brenda pushed Sarah?
Because she wanted to get on the screen.
What the research found might surprise you. The first headline: overall, young white children are far more negative about interactions between the races than young black children. When white children were shown these pictures, they had a negative interpretation 70% of the time, meaning they were much more likely to say this:
How did he fall off?
I think Linda pushed Sarah off the screen.
Do you think that he did something that was good or bad?
That
that they were to say this.
And how good would you say what Bobby is doing is?
super good.
Super good.
White kids are also far more likely to think the white child and black child in the picture are not friends, and think their parents wouldn't approve of them being friends. But why? Responses like this might begin to explain.
Do you think it would be as easy to ask your mom to have someone over who's the same skin color and someone over who's a different skin color?
Yeah, that might be hard.
What about it might be hard?
Because all my people in my family are white and not much of people that my mom knows and dad knows are black or brown.
Yeah. So it might be kind of hard to ask your mom to have a friend over who's black or brown? What do you hear?
Oh, I don't want to be a friend because I would be
What is it about skin color that sometimes kids think they might not want to be friends?
because they like their color and they don't like brown, so they want a white color.
But they in that biggest situation.
Our expert, Dr. Melanie Killen, says children's own experiences with race, along with the messages they hear at school and at home, the characters in the TV shows they watch, what they see online, all of those have an effect. But the subtle messages adults might not even realize they're sending also have a huge effect on children. Dr. Killen calls it implicit bias.
When we're in a situation in public, we're in a room, and we have an opportunity to ask two different people for help with something, and we might just, be more likely to ask the person of the same race or somebody of the opposite race for help. All of that really has a very powerful influence very early in children's lives, much earlier than we think.
But if all kids internalize what they see and hear about race, why are young black children more positive about race than young whites? Remember, 70% of young white kids saw these and thought something negative happened. When black children looked at the same pictures, only 38% saw something negative, meaning they were much more likely to see this.
What's going on with Carrie? What's going on with Chris? He was waiting his turn.
Positive attitudes despite experiences like this.
My grandma wanted to be only a good friend because he's always running out of leg. Okay, so it happened with your son's mom, that only wanted him to be friends with people who were the same color, and so we didn't want you to be friends with him. How does it make you feel? Sad. And was it something that they said? How did they feel? To more good because they're not the same color. They said that you can't be friends because you're not the same color. She dropped her.
6-year-old Ciara was so vocal about race, I asked her more questions afterward.
You heard people talk about other people's skin color. And what kind of stuff do they say?
They say to the teacher, with the black skin can make up feel in high school.
You've heard people say that?
So why are young black children more positive about race than young whites? Dr. Killen says the misperception of some parents that kids are colorblind has a lot to do with it.
African American parents are very early on preparing their children for the world of diversity and also for the world of potential discrimination. In contrast, what we find is that a lot of white parents, they sort of have this view that if you talk about race, you are creating the problem. And what we're finding is that children are aware of race very early.
Anderson Cooper, CNN.
So one of the things that I take away from that particular piece is that we need to show our kids through our actions, and we show the world through our actions what we stand for and how we value diversity, how we look at race, because it's in our actions that these things really start to happen. And it's not lip service, and it's being cognitive. And for some of us, it's going to be tiring in the beginning, just like you're starting a new exercise regimen. It takes a bit of patience and tenacity until you finally get it. It becomes habitual, and that's when we start to rip away the imposed meanings of all of these things and actually get to authentic human relationships. There's dignity and honor in being human. And believe me, once we get to that place, race and all these other side conversations are no longer a distraction because we start to see human beings as human beings. My name is Andre Cohen. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Andre. Yeah, I'll talk to you more, Andre.
All right.
Let's take off.
All right.
Very interesting stuff, Robin. Thanks, Andre.
Thanks, man.
Really good to see stuff. Yeah, other people.
One day we will.
Okay.
One day we will. Any questions, comments, observations?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is not how I raise my children, but,